I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Sylvia Sumira here. Many of you will know Sylvia, many of you might not. She's an independent conservator specialising in globes. You've been doing this for forever, haven't you? For a very long time, yeah. She has a degree in the history of art and gained a postgrad diploma in paper conservation. She's also worked in globe conservation at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich and served several years and spent a period of study at the Austrian National Library in Vienna. Since setting up her own studio, she's carried out extensive work for many clients, both public and private, both in Britain and overseas. Sylvia has led several workshops on globe conservation and has many publications to her name, including her book, The Art and History of Globes, published by the British Library. She's an accredited member of the UK Institute of Conservation and a fellow of the International Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. So without further ado, over to you, Sylvia.
After Eric's fascinating survey of his digital game realm, I'm going to take you back to an analogue world, globes. So as Nick said, I'm a conservator specialising in printed globes, and I'm often asked, how are they made? And also, when were they first made? So this afternoon, I'd like to tell you a little bit about their history, how they were made, and give you an insight into the conservation work I do. So globes have existed for a vast span of time, as we can see here. It seems the concept of the Earth as a sphere emerged around the time of Pythagoras in the 6th century BC. And the idea of making spherical models of the world and the heavens also originated with the ancient Greeks. And of course, globes can be made from many different materials, as we see here. But one standard method evolved in the 16th century, which I'll concentrate on later. The image on the left shows the earliest surviving globe, and it's thought to date from around 150 AD. It's known as the Farnese Atlas, and it's a celestial globe carved in marble, and it depicts Atlas carrying the heavens on his shoulders. I hesitated about including this image of Michael Palin carrying his plastic globe, Atlas fashion, next to an image of the Titan himself. But this unlikely pairing of a celestial and a terrestrial globe demonstrates that for almost 2,000 years, a sphere has remained the most simple, perfect, and compact way of modelling the cosmos, the planet on which we live, and the heavens that surround us. Now today, I think many of us tend to think of a globe as being a model of the Earth. But celestial globes, models of the heavens, were made long before terrestrial globes. So after this marble globe, there was a long gap of about 1,000 years before globes were made again. In Northern Europe, the idea of a spherical Earth gradually became accepted from the time of the Venerable Bede in the 8th century. And then sparse references to celestial globes resurfaced from the 10th century. And there are records of terrestrial globes made in the 15th century, but none survive, apart from one. This one. The oldest extant terrestrial globe was made by Martin Beheim of Nuremberg in 1492. At the time, Nuremberg was a centre for Renaissance scholars, artists, instrument makers, and commerce of all types. After travelling widely for commercial reasons, he was commissioned by the city patricians to produce a terrestrial globe to show the known world. And this is 1492. So perhaps the most remarkable feature of this globe now is that America is not depicted, for the globe was completed before Christopher Columbus returned from his westerly voyage. As you can see, this globe was made shortly before 1500, and this is a very convenient date to bear in mind when thinking about globes, as before then, the few that were made, including this one, were all manuscript. That is, they were unique items. They were drawn, painted, engraved, or carved by hand. They were made from a variety of materials: marble, metal, parchment, and paper. They were slow and costly to make and couldn't easily be replicated. In the early 16th century, serious interest in globes grew, and globe making developed quite rapidly, when several factors came together to make it possible to produce globes in greater numbers for a wide market. The technical innovation of printing had enabled the circulation of all kinds of text, and it stimulated an intellectual interest in the world and the cosmos. Furthermore, the age of exploration was truly underway. Navigation became a crucial skill for the advancement of trade and conquest, and constantly expanding geographical and astronomical knowledge fueled the demand for maps and sea charts. Maps were being printed by the end of the 15th century, and therefore their circulation and availability was greatly increased. And it's not surprising, therefore, that the idea of making printed spherical models of the earth and heavens gained momentum. The widespread production and use of globes in Europe really begins in the 16th century when they start to be printed. A highly significant advance in globe making came in 1507, when the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller designed a set of printed gauze. Now, to explain, a gaur is the name given to one of the segments of printed paper that cover a globe. These small woodcut gauze would have made a globe of about 12 centimetres in diameter. Today, there are no examples of a mounted globe which survive. And the globes you see on the lower part of the slide are a couple of models I was asked to make to show what the globe would have looked like. This globe was a small distillation of Waldseemüller's large world map Universalis Cosmographica, and it's the first printed map to show America. So you can see it on the globe here. So though very crude compared with the later globes, these gauze herald a new era of globe making. They introduce a completely new technical and practical aspect to the craft and are hugely important. So a decade after Waldseemüller, the German polymath Johann Schöner started publishing globes, and he was the first to bring celestial and terrestrial globes together as a matched pair. They became inextricably bound together in this period. While terrestrial globes were able to show the land and sea, celestial globes could show the layout of the stars. On a practical level, the mapping of the heavens was crucial for seafaring, as sailors navigated across the seas using the positions of the stars. These factors, combined with the contemporary intellectual interest in cosmography, that's the study and representation of the relationship of the earth to the heavens, it made this pairing of a terrestrial with a celestial globe immensely significant. While each type of globe had a value on its own, together they formed a compact model of the cosmos which would be adopted by globe makers for the next 300 years. I'm showing this painting, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Holbein's The Ambassadors of 1533, because the celestial globe, go back, there, on the top shelf, it's very clearly depicted, and it's undoubtedly based on a Schöner globe. Now, only 3 of his later globes survive, the 2 in Weimar you've just seen, and this one on the right. Now, this globe, this very globe, is actually on display across the road from here in the History of Science Museum. So if you have time, you can actually go across the road, down to the basement gallery and see this globe. So that's a very special opportunity to do that. So the printing technique that Schöner used was woodcut. This allowed only limited detail, and fresh wood blocks would have to be cut if changes were to be made. The actual spheres were solid wood or hollowed out wood. So Schöner had created a market for globes, and the demand for them increased. And so others started to take an interest in their production. So in the 1530s, globes started to be made in the university town of Louvain. The physician and mathematician Hemifrisius published a pair of globes that were really the prototype on which subsequent globes were based. They were significant as they demonstrate 2 more innovations. The gauze were engraved on copper plates, which allowed much finer detail, and the spheres were constructed from paper and plaster. And that's the basic structure for globes that came to be dominant until the end of the 19th century. A collaborator on these globes was Gerard Mercator. You can see his name there. And he was a student of Hemmer. His name is engraved on both globes, and they appear to be amongst the earliest work attributable to Mercator. Now today, Mercator is probably better known for his world map of 1569, and of course we're all familiar with the Mercator projection. But in 1541, he made his own terrestrial globe, and in 1551, he published a companion celestial globe. He added his own refinements, including the printing of rhumb lines on his terrestrial globe, which indisputably linked his globes to navigation, and he mounted his globes in sturdy wooden stands. Globes provided a very convenient, up-to-date representation of the earth and heavens, visible at a glance. But they weren't only maps. When they were suspended in meridian rings, so these rings here, and mounted in a stand with a horizon ring, they became analog computers that could find the solution to all kinds of geographical, astronomical and navigational problems relating to the apparent motions of the Earth, Sun and stars. And most globe makers actually published manuals with instructions on how to use their globes. So, though other globes were made at this time, Mercator's globes dominated Europe until the last decade of the 16th century, when there was a flurry of new globe-making activity. The first printed globes to appear in England were made by Emery Molyneux in 1592. The terrestrial globe highlighted English maritime enterprise and achievement, and it showed the voyages and discoveries of Francis Drake, Thomas Cavendish, John Davis, Martin Frobisher, and many other English explorers. It appears that the globes were made in great numbers and that a smaller edition was made. Thomas Bodley, in fact, bought a pair for the library here. He paid £20 in 1602. Unfortunately, they were disposed of during the 17th century because of wear and tear, and were replaced with a pair of Blau globes. However, now, just over 400 years later, only a handful of Molyneux globes survive. There are 3 here in England, and the other 2, both celestial, are in Germany. The only surviving terrestrial globe from 1592 is the one on the left at Petworth House. And there's an updated pair from 1603 in the Middle Temple Library in London. Now, at the same time, globes were being made in vast numbers in Amsterdam. The map makers Jodocus Hondius, Willem Blau, and the Van Langeren family made globes too and became fiercely competitive. And I've deliberately put Blau and Hondius facing away from each other because I know they were rivals. So the Dutch dominated globe making in the 17th century, and then globes started to be made on a much wider scale throughout Europe. So this globe, on its simple pillar stand, makes a virtue of its low price, 5 shillings. Compared with Martin Beheim's globe of 1492, this humble example succinctly demonstrates how globes have changed over the course of 400 years. Having been precious, rare and novel objects with a limited circulation, by the end of the 19th century, they'd become items of mass production available to everyone. So, how were they actually made? So when we look at a globe, it's the information on the surface that's the focus of our attention. The cartography on a terrestrial globe and the constellation and stars on a celestial globe. But the materials of construction aren't really given much thought. But as I'm a conservator, I have to deal with these things. There are a few published accounts of the actual operation of globe making, and though they vary in detail, they generally agree about the method and materials of manufacture. An account with illustrations of the actual process appeared in Diderot's Encyclopedia in the mid-18th century. It was written by the French globe maker Robert Vaugondy. Firstly, a globe maker required a mould of a slightly smaller diameter than the globe to be made. In Diderot, this was a wooden half ball, which you see there. Then according to other descriptions, it could be a whole wooden ball. So some time ago, I decided to make a globe from scratch. And on the right, you see my effort to make a globe. My mould was a wooden ball about 7.5 inches in diameter. Wooden spheres became impractical for larger globes, and therefore hollow copper hemispheres were used. However, whatever the type of mould, it was used to form 2 paper hemispheres, which were joined together to form the inner shell of the globe sphere. Several overlapping layers of paper or thin card were pasted over the mould until thick enough to be rigid when removed. In Diderot, it is specified that the inner shell should be 3 layers of overlapping card, and here's a helpful diagram to show you 3 layers of overlapping card. I used, as you can see, brown paper envelopes. When you had your sphere or hemispheres, you had to join them together. So they'd usually be supported internally by a wooden pillar running from pole to pole, into which the pivot pins were driven. And this pillar could be a single piece of turned or carved wood, or it could have additional branches extending from its midpoint, which you see here. On my globe, you can see it's just a single wooden pillar. Occasionally, a metal rod support was used. So the pillar was attached to the hemispheres with nails and glue, very simple. They could either be joined at the equator or occasionally over the poles. So various methods were used to secure and join the seal, such as pasting on more paper or occasionally cloth, and sometimes by sewing them together with twine. And this little globe here, you can see the stitches. Using this damaged globe, you can see the stitches holding the globe together. So after joining, the rough shell was placed in a semicircular metal template of the required globe diameter, and it was turned while plaster was applied. The edge of the template would remove the excess plaster, and eventually a sphere would emerge onto which the printed gauze could be pasted. So this method started being used in the mid-16th century, and it was still being used in the 20th century, which you see in these images from a Pathé newsreel of 1955. So during the course of my work, where globes have become damaged, I sometimes have the opportunity to look at parts of the globe that are normally hidden from view. So here you see a few pictures of the interiors of several globes I've worked on. It shows a variety of internal supports, and it's also interesting to see the papers which were used at the first stage of building the paper sphere. So on the left, it's just plain brown card paper. On this globe here, it's actually the pages of a book used to line the globe. And here, Carey, who's a map maker, you can see he's using old maps. So it's a very kind of interesting use of the recycling of paper. So sometimes weights were attached to the inner shell to balance the globe when the plaster was thicker on one side. And so that's what this little bag is here. It's a little weight placed inside the globe to balance it. A hole was cut in the plaster sphere, and that's how the bag was inserted into the globe. The bags were filled with lead shot. So if a globe rattles when you turn it, it's most probably because the bag has burst and the shot has spilled out. You see that here, a hole's in the bag, there's the lead shot. And if you hear a clunk, it's probably because the whole bag has fallen off and is just clunking around the bottom of the globe. So when the plaster sphere had been made, the gauze could be pasted on it. So using 12 gauze came to be standard practice, 12 being a very convenient factor of 360 degrees. though on larger globes there might be 18 or even more gauze, and they could be cut, as you see here, at the equator, so you have a half gore, and sometimes they were cut also at the poles, so you have a polar cap covering the poles. But anyway, as I said, 12 was the kind of normal number. So you heard earlier that globe gauze in the early part of the 16th century were made using woodcut, but this had its limitations. So by the mid-16th century, engraved globe gauze became the norm. Engraving had several advantages. It was easier to make fine and curved lines. It was easier to incorporate lettering, and one could make larger plates. And it also allowed more expression by the engraver, and it could be updated more easily. So globes continued to be engraved until the latter part of the 19th century. But from the mid-century, they started to be printed using colour lithography. This marked another change in globe production. They could be made at lower cost and in greater numbers. Lithography gradually took over from engraving as the main printing technique used for globes. So whatever the printing technique, the difficulty of pasting flat paper gauze neatly onto a sphere should not be underestimated. The paper had to be stretched to fit on the sphere, and the expansion of paper when wet with paste also had to be taken into account. If you got it wrong, the gauze would overlap, or worse still, there'd be gaps between the gauze. So the actual design of the information on gauze was fraught with difficulties because of the stretching of the paper. Straight lines on a flat piece of paper become curved when they are pasted onto a sphere. And there were several theories about the best way to design the gauze. This is a tricky thing to get right, but globe makers managed to overcome these difficulties just judging on the evidence of the globes themselves. So when the gauze had been pasted onto the spheres, they could then be coloured with watercolour. Lithography, of course, enabled the gauze to be printed in colour, which was commercially beneficial as it speeded up the process. And finally, a varnish was applied to protect against dust, dirt, and inquisitive fingers. A varnish also made the colours appear richer and brighter. And just in case you're wondering, this is my globe, again with its plaster coating before the gauze were applied. And on the right, you can see the final result. So the heyday of globe making in a knowledge-hungry Europe extended from the 16th to the 19th centuries. There could be magnificent objects installed in grand libraries and in the homes of the educated classes. They were dedicated to kings, queens, and other potentates. In addition to being scientific, educational, and cartographical instruments, they became symbols of power, discovery, and learning. So many globes have survived the passage of time in remarkably good condition, but some have suffered through natural aging combined with neglect and sometimes mistreatment, and these are the globes that come to my studio. There are several patterns of damage that can be seen time and time again. Regarding the surface, the round shape of a globe can itself contribute to different rates of decline over this area in several ways. The uppermost hemisphere is obviously more exposed, and it's thus more affected by dust and dirt. The condition north and south can be very different in other ways too. Above the equator, greater exposure to light may cause the varnish to become more crazed and brittle than below the equator. And it can also cause colours to fade more. So you see these slides, you can see the difference in the crazing of the varnish north and south. Unfortunately, from the conservation point of view, globes were made to be touched and turned. And so the northern hemisphere gets a rough deal simply because it's more accessible and easier to touch. And it's demonstrated in this print showing Mercator and Hondius destroying their own globes by using a pair of dividers. The use of dividers on a globe is not recommended. There's only one correct way to place a globe in its stand. The graduated face of the brass meridian ring should line up with the central axis on the horizon ring. If placed the other way, the globe is off-centre, and this can cause scraping and abrasion of the globe surface. Oops. Sorry. So you see that these scrapes here. I think it's because the globe has been forced to turn in the stand, placed in the stand the wrong way and forced to turn and rub against the horizon ring. So let's see. And once the varnish becomes damaged, the underlying paper and printing become more vulnerable through exposure to air, dust and abrasion. So damage to the shell is often seen. As globes age, the plaster and adhesives become brittle, and an impact, a globe being dropped or being knocked over, can result in the sphere splitting at its weakest part around the join of the two hemispheres, often at the equator, but it can also be along the north-south axis if the globe is joined longitudinally. And that's what you see here. So damage at the poles is commonly seen, and knocks and impacts can cause the plaster to shatter randomly, and this inevitably affects the uppermost paper and varnish layer. You see that there. There are sometimes concerns about the stability of the hidden wooden support inside the globe. Outward appearances can be deceptive. A well-preserved looking globe with no damage to the plaster may conceal an inner wooden support completely reduced to frass through woodworm activity. And that's what you see here. Though the surface of this globe looked a little worn, the shell looked fine with no obvious damage. However, at a later stage of treatment, it was seen that inside the globe, the support pillar had been completely destroyed by woodworm. So that's what's left of the support pillar. Other parts of a globe must also be considered. The printed paper horizon ring that usually encircles a globe can suffer in the same way that a globe surface does, through dirt and also damage to its wooden support. The wooden stand can become scuffed and dirty, and parts can break and split. And globes sometimes have compasses, which often have missing parts. Regarding the metalwork, meridian rings and other metal parts can become corroded. And here on this, you can see this is the surface of this meridian ring. And once I took the clamp off, you can see the brass shining through, which has been protected by the clamp from the air. They can also be bent out of shape, and screws can be lost. So generally, these are the most common types of damage that I see, and they're the symptoms of what I call old globe syndrome. Though, of course, other types of damage and deterioration will inevitably crop up. So, what do I do when they come to me for treatment? There will often be several treatment options available and possible, which I'll discuss with the owner, and then we can decide on the course to follow before work starts. Now, the aim of any conservation treatment is to stabilise the condition of the globe, repair any damage, and make the globe look as good as possible. So in the final part of my talk, I'll show you a couple of examples of minor and major conservation treatment. So this is a pair of globes made in 1770 by George Adams, a leading British mathematical instrument maker. They were presented to New College, Oxford, just down the road from here, in the same year, and have remained there ever since, displayed in glass cases, which date from the same time. The cases played a large part in protecting the globes. However, they weren't dust-proof, and a substantial amount of clinging dust had accumulated on all parts, including the wood and metal, making them look dull and lifeless. So they'd retained their original varnish, and though there were one or two scratches here and there, they were generally in fair condition. And in addition, some of the brasswork had become corroded and had turned black. So I'll concentrate on the celestial globe. So loose dust was brushed away, and then cleaning tests were carried out. Gently rolling cotton wool swabs, lightly dampened with water, was very effective in removing the grime and made a huge difference to the appearance of the globes, as you see here. Though the varnish had yellowed, it was felt there was no need to remove it, as it was more or less intact, and the information on the globes was clearly visible. And of course, the brass elements and the wooden stand were also cleaned, and the terrestrial globe was treated in the same way. So, I always tried to make the treatment as minimal as possible, and in this case, minimal treatment was all that was needed to make the globes look respectable again and give them a new lease of life. And so on the left you see the globe before treatment, and on the right after treatment was completed. Sometimes, however, a little bit more work is required. So here you see a pair of globes by Dudley Adams, son of George Adams, who made the New College globe, dating from, you can see 1813 is the date on the terrestrial globe. The terrestrial globe was severely damaged at North and South poles, and a great deal of paper and plaster was missing. The central support pillar had become detached from the shell, and there were other cracks in the plaster in other areas. The celestial globe had also suffered, and there was severe abrasion at the poles and loss of paper. So here you can see the damage at the North and South poles on the terrestrial globe and also on the celestial globe. So there were scratches and scrapes to the surface, all over the surface of each globe. In this case, the varnish was very badly damaged, and I removed it. Then I was able to assess the condition of the underlying paper. Though there were some areas where dirt had penetrated the paper, the varnish on the whole had done quite a good job in protecting the paper. So with the terrestrial globe, I had to rebuild the damaged shell, secure the support pillar, which had become adrift, and replace the missing paper. So here you see it at 3 different stages. On the left, that's before treatment began. And on the right, you see the South Pole. In the middle, sorry, you see the South Pole with the pillar removed before I'd actually started to repair the damage there. And on the right, you see the globe after treatment with the pillar replaced. I had to infill the area with paper, and then I actually coloured it into tone so it matched the original colour of the globe, and also drew in lines of longitude and latitude, which I will do if it's an infill. So I won't actually touch the original material on the globe. It's just on any infills that I do, just to make the appearance pull together. And this is the celestial globe. Again, it's the South Pole before treatment. In the middle, you see the globe halfway through varnish removal, and on the right, you see the globe with the damage repaired and any retouching carried out. So, just to remind you, this is what the globes looked like before I started treating them. And again, you can see the brasswork had discoloured through corrosion. And after treatment, they looked like this, kind of given a new lease of life again. So to finish, so these are the globes in their stands before treatment. And again, reassembled after conservation, after treatment of all parts. So I hope I've given you a little insight into the type of work I do. Thank you.
What's your most interesting discovery inside a globe?
Ooh. It's the range of papers I've seen inside globes is quite remarkable. So sometimes it's just plain paper, as we've seen. Pages of books crop up quite often, music manuscripts, lottery, 17th and 18th century lottery tickets have cropped up, bus tables, train timetables, What else have I seen? Oh yes, there was a Carey globe, I think it was, and it was actually minutes from selected committee meetings from the Houses of Parliament in the 19th century. So I think it's just waste paper being reused. They just need something to cover the mould with initially, and so whatever paper came to hand. But I think the one I like is the Carey globe with the maps, Carey maps. So that particular globe, the globe itself was dated 1820, and looking at the maps inside the globe, they were about 1806. So they were probably out-of-date maps. So he was just recycling them to make his globes. Yeah.
Very inventive. Then following on from that, what's the most unusual materials you've come across when conserving a globe, and what is the most innovative use of these materials?
Well, the materials that are used to make a globe are more or less consistent. So it's kind of card, kind of rough brown paper or paper. And so that's it really. You know, that's how globe makers made their globes. So I haven't really come across any other materials. I mean, I have occasionally worked on manuscript globes. So again, but it tends to be paper, and then very careful inking in of the actual information on the globe. I did come across, rather than having a little lead bag as a weight, the side of the globe was cracked, the paper was kind of fractured. And I lifted off the paper, and in fact the weight was actually little sheets of lead which had been kind of embedded in the plaster. And of course, over time, plaster becomes brittle, the lead doesn't give way. So what gives way is the plaster. So that's caused the plaster to fracture and the paper over it to fracture. Yeah.
How intriguing. Well, the next question is a very popular question, in that there's been more than one submission on this one. And it's a very straightforward question. How do you remove the varnish?
Two ways. It can be done mechanically, and on many British globes, the varnish becomes very brittle, and by careful scraping with a scalpel, I can take it off. Otherwise, I use solvents, and I have to test for which solvent is the most appropriate to use. Yeah.
So I'm guessing there's a whole lot of experience required to make sure
and one has to be very
right.
careful that. I mean, the printing ink used on globes, it's bound in oil, so that's usually fine using solvents. But one always has to test to make sure that's not, one isn't taking pigment off, or indeed the printing ink, because it's one should never assume that everything is always going to work in the same way as it did before. So one always tests to make sure that whatever materials I'm using aren't actually affecting the surface of the globe, or the inks, or the colours and so on. Yeah.
It's a huge responsibility, isn't it? But
sometimes it takes a little while. You know, if I have a globe in my studio, it takes a little while. I have to kind of look at it, take photographs, think about it, look at it, maybe do a few tests before I actually start work on it. It takes a little time to get used to this thing there, sitting there, waiting for work to be done. Yeah.
It sounds incredibly high pressure to me. I can't imagine the thought process of going through that and the responsibility, but it just makes me feel that we're privileged to be in such company here today.
I think all conservators feel that. I mean, we talked about the conservation of other things. I think everybody who is involved in conservation, you know, they have that kind of, well, you have to have a respect for the things that you're working on and never make assumptions about it.
No, of course. This is a slightly different angle. What is the survival rate of early printed globes compared with other materials such as maps and atlases?
Well, with globes, it's an interesting question, that, because regarding the Molyneux globes, we hear they were made in great numbers. As I said, Thomas Bodley bought a pair, and there are records of other people acquiring them. There are two celestial globes in Germany. Emery Molyneux actually moved to Amsterdam in the 1590s, I think, in a hope of kind of promoting his globes throughout Europe. So there were two remaining ones in Germany. Very few survive now. None survive of his smaller globes. However, Mercator, whose globes were made in, throughout the second half of the 16th century. I think there are about 40 of his globes surviving. Again, we don't know how many were made, but there's an awful lot surviving. So why some survive and others don't, I really don't know. But of course, one thing about globes is that they do take up a lot of space. So with a map, you can store it quite easily. With globes, they're more difficult. And I think when globes became out of date, they were just regarded as redundant. Now, of course, an early globe now is kind of a fabulous, wonderful thing. But if it became out of date, you know, if in 1660, if your globe was made 50 years before, well, it was obviously out of date, so maybe it didn't have so much value. And in fact, there are records, Thomas Bodley writing to his librarian, talking about the expense of keeping the globes in good repair. So I think he was a bit worried about the cost, because they were obviously used, these globes, and they were getting a bit worn. And eventually they were disposed of, I don't know when, the 1630s. And then I think they acquired a pair of Blau globes. And what's happened to them, Nick? Have you any idea?
I have absolutely no idea. It's absolutely no idea.
Yeah.
We occasionally see them in pictures.
There's this wonderful print of the Bodleian Library, and I think it's a Logan print from the 60s. Yeah, and it shows a pair of globes there. Yeah. So there were some globes here at some point.
Yes, it's a great pity. Actually, we do have a facsimile of the behind globe in the reading room, which is, if you're in there, it's well worth having a look. It's only been there for past 10 years or so, but it is there.
Well, it is worth having a look, because I mean, the globe in a way was accurate, because it was made to show the known world in 1492, and in 1492, at least at the start of it, the known world did not include America. So you can say it's a kind of accurate globe of its time. Yeah.
And we've probably only got time for one more question. It's a straightforward one. Are globe gores still available?
Well, not easily. I mean, you can't just go out and buy them. And occasionally at auctions, globe gores do come up for sale. But you know, you don't. I mean, there are globe gores in library collections and so on, but it's not something that you can just easily find these days. And there are a couple of companies who make globes, modern globes today, and in fact, they use the same thing: strips of paper, printed flat, and then pasted onto a globe. So, yeah, that's the way globes are made. You know, many globes are made, I mean, there are other modern techniques of printed, you know, lithographically pressed card and so on. And of course you have plastic globes, and I've no idea how they make those, to be honest. So, but yeah, there are still people making globes today using globe gores.
Well, it's great to see that they're still being made, and that they always strike me as being items of such stunning beauty. Sylvia, that has been a remarkable last 3/4 of an hour. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm sure none of us are going to forget what we've learned. So if you join me in thanking Sylvia,